Our thinking about strategy and conflict changed dramatically with the coming of the era of Napoleon in the late 18th century. And the American and French revolutions of that century dramatically altered the international political and social landscapes. These revolutions gave birth to new forms of government rooted in the values of the Anglo-Scottish Enlightenment and in the Continental Enlightenment of the previous 100 years. The Enlightenment mobilized the power of reason to reform society and advance knowledge across numerous fields: science, politics, medicine, education, and war. It was inevitable that Enlightenment emphasis on reason and exploration of fundamentals of social life would prompt new thinking about war. Intelligent men began to question the way we think. They questioned the way we compete. And they questioned the way we think about competing. Now, the 18th century works of the great French general Maurice de Saxe and of Frederick the Great began to line the outlines of battle principles that would lay the groundwork for Napoleon Bonaparte. Maurice de Saxe, in a work published posthumously in 1757 called Reveries on the Art of War, revived and extended the Roman insights transmitted by Vegetius. Frederick the Great's most important achievement came in the ability to drill large numbers of troops so effectively that they could, for example, fire their weapons twice as fast as the enemy. Now, it is with Napoleon, one of the greatest European soldiers ever to stride the stage of history, that we mark the dawn of the modern era of strategic thinking. All of the elements for a military strategic revolution were present: new thinking, new technologies, and increasing populations. All that was needed was the melding of the right man with the moment to assemble them to powerful effect. Now, the ascension of Napoleon to the role of Europe's greatest soldier came as a result of this perfect storm. We now look at Napoleon's genius and the two great theorists of the 19th century who interpreted his battles for us: Antoine Jomini and Karl von Clausewitz. Now, we study Napoleon to discover lessons, deep lessons, in how strategy has developed from its ancient forms, how it's progressed and come to terms with an environment that changes constantly, and how it can confer competitive advantage in the goals we pursue. Napoleon himself urged careful study of the greatest generals in his famous maxim number 78. Read and reread the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Caesar, Gustavus Adolphus, Turenne, Prince Eugene, and of Frederick the Great. Model yourself after them. That is the only means of becoming a great captain and of acquiring the secrets of the art of war. Your genius, enlightened by this study, you will then reject every maxim contradictory to those of these great men. Now, the Napoleonic era stretched roughly from 1799 to 1815, and this was a 16-year period that saw the military and political rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. His rise paralleled the fall of the French monarchy and success of the French Revolution in 1789. Napoleon named himself emperor in 1804, and he became for a time the master of all of continental Europe, and he sought to spread the ideals of the French Revolution: liberté, égalité, fraternité. Now, Napoleon reformed the French legal system, and he introduced the Napoleonic Code, the influence of which can still be seen and felt in the modern civil law constructs of 21st century Europe. His greatest fame, however, stems from his many military victories over a series of European coalitions. Napoleon exemplifies strategic thinking in that he demonstrates the power of ideas over material resources. He often fought and won against numerically superior forces, which leaves us with the question: how did he do it? Thorough preparation and development of superior capabilities, superior strategy based on superior capabilities, and crisp execution of the proper tactics to fulfill that strategy. The contribution of Napoleon to strategic thinking is manifold. Throughout his career, the great general would record his insights, and they're distilled in a famous volume called The Military Maxims of Napoleon. They're useful, and they are pithy, and I think they'll delight you as much as they delight me. His own maxims serve even today as a practical guide of how a great strategic mind approaches tactical problems and weaves their solution into a coherent whole. You solve these tactical problems not singly, but in a comprehensive, linked fashion that is designed to achieve greater aims. Now, Napoleon's thinking was so clear, so purely focused on the battlefield, that his axioms speak with immediacy, like thunderbolts from the past. An army which cannot be reinforced is already defeated. The moment of greatest peril is the moment of victory. An army ought to be ready every moment to offer all the resistance of which it is capable. There is only one favorable moment in war. Talent consists in knowing how to seize it. And a commander-in-chief ought to ask himself several times a day, if the enemy should appear on my front, on my right, on my left, what would I do? And if the question finds him uncertain, he is not well placed, he is not as he should be, and he should remedy it. Now, Napoleon recognized that some people view strategy as a checklist of techniques. The unspoken assumption here is, if you learn the techniques, well, then you too can be a great general. Now, this is possibly the greatest danger for us as strategic thinkers today. To think of strategy in this one-dimensional manner. To think of strategy as static or as a formula. On this point, Napoleon said, "Unhappy the general who comes on the field of battle with a system." Napoleon himself understood well this paradox. The best plan, the best strategy, can be overturned by its very implementation. Napoleon said this, "In war, theory is all right so far as general principles are concerned, but in reducing general principles to practice, there will always be danger." Certainly, you have to understand the fundamental principles of conflict. This is essential to any strategic thinker. But we cannot stop there. It is in the execution of our strategy that we discover our mettle, not to blindly follow our own plan, but to adjust what we do to what our competitor does in a constant process. Napoleon exalted flexibility and the skill of response to an opponent's actions. Now, Napoleon offered us two great strategies that he employed throughout the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century. These strategies were certainly available to others, had they but employed them in the same way as Napoleon, with the same preparation and the same vigor. For it was what Napoleon did at the front end and at the back end of the battle that made his strategy work. Napoleon first developed the capabilities necessary to execute them. Second, he executed his strategy with attention to detail and follow through. He constantly adapted his maneuvers to the changing conditions of the battlefield. Now let's look at Napoleon's two broad strategic maneuvers: the strategy of the central position and the strategy of indirect approach. Now, time again, Napoleon employed these maneuvers at the appropriate place and time to achieve victory. The strategy he chose depended on several factors, including the terrain, the weather, the numbers of troops involved, and overall capabilities as he judged them. Now, when Napoleon fought outnumbered, he would use the central position strategy, maneuvering his army to a position between the coalition armies facing him. He would drive a wedge between them. Because of command and control difficulties of the time, the two opposing armies could not coordinate their actions. And Napoleon would seek battle with one while leaving a masking force to hold the second army in place. He would destroy the first in detail, and then he would turn on the other. Now, this maneuver was the expression of Napoleon's almost maniacal devotion to the principle of concentration in time and in space. Concentration means that when you attack, you mount a preponderance of force at the point of attack, even if overall you're outnumbered. Napoleon put it this way: the secret of great battles means knowing how to deploy and concentrate at the right time. The art of war means being able, even with an inferior army, to have stronger forces than the enemy at the point of attack or at the point which is attacked. Now, with this strategy of the central position, Napoleon could achieve the highest concentration of men in the primary battle while limiting the enemy's ability to concentrate his forces. This maneuver served him well for years, and he used it in his last battle. This was Napoleon's battle plan at the 1815 Battle of Waterloo, which is located in Belgium. Napoleon began to drive a wedge between the two Allied armies on June 16th, and he recorded several small victories against the Prussians the next 2 days. And then he turned to face the British. He sent a masking force out to block the Prussians from regrouping or reinforcing. But this force, this masking force under Marshal Grouchy, failed to find the Prussians. The Prussians, under Marshal Blucher, slipped through the screen, and they fell upon the French flank at the crucial point of the battle after Napoleon had already committed his reserve. This was Napoleon's final and greatest defeat, an ignominious rout. It was not the preparation that failed. It was not the strategy that was flawed. It was in the execution of the strategy that Napoleon's Grande Armée was defeated. The failure to mask his flank and rear from the Prussians. What of the other strategy? That of the indirect approach. When Napoleon had strength comparable to his opponents and room to maneuver, he would use the strategy of indirect approach. He would position a small force to the front of the enemy. Now, this force would, as we say, demonstrate. It would skirmish, feigning a major attack. Simultaneously, the French main force would swiftly march to the enemy flanks or to the rear. Presumably, the enemy would be distracted by the demonstration to its front, skirmishing, and be surprised by Napoleon's swift march to the rear. Napoleon would place himself on the enemy's lines of communication and supply, and the enemy would be forced to fight at a disadvantage or withdraw, losing much in the retreat. Now, apart from his military maxims, Napoleon left us no great compendium of his strategic perspective or of his personal system of battle. It was left to others to analyze his battles and to tease from them the strategic secrets locked within. Napoleon is tightly bound up with the names of the two most influential military theorists of the 19th century, Antoine Jomini and Karl von Clausewitz. Both theorists offered powerful interpretations of the Napoleonic Wars, and they influenced the making and implementation of strategy even today. In fact, the lessons of Napoleon are largely the lessons of Jomini and Clausewitz. Antoine Jomini was a Swiss citizen and an officer in Napoleon's Grande Armée, a student of the campaigns of Frederick the Great. He first rose to prominence by his writing on military matters, which brought him to the attention of Marshal Ney, an officer whom Napoleon called the bravest of the brave. No mere armchair theorist, Jomini fought with distinction at the battles of Austerlitz and Lutzen. He spent the last decades of his life as a general and an advisor for the Russian Tsar. Now, throughout his professional life, Jomini sought the lodestone of military art to divine the secrets of battle. And in his Art of War from 1838, he believed he had discovered them. And this is the work often credited with being the very first to define strategy, tactics, and logistics as three distinct realms. Of these, defining the overall principles of strategy was his prime concern. Jomini said, "There have existed in all times fundamental principles on which depend good results in warfare. These principles are unchanging, independent of the kind of weapons, of historical time, and of place." According to Jomini, the fundamental principle of strategy was that of concentration. Concentration of forces at the decisive point on the battlefield. Now, this concentration consisted of four interrelated elements. First, bringing by strategic measures most of your forces to bear upon the decisive areas of a theater of war, and upon your enemy's communications without compromising your own. Now, if we apply this principle of concentration to modern-day business, for instance, one way it can play out is if we bring our resources to bear on a single critical part of, say, the competitive marketplace, whether that be a critical geographical location or a critical demographic of a particular market segment. In this way, we can match or overmatch a larger competitor in a particular slice of the market. Second, maneuvering to engage your major forces against parts only of those of the enemy. Third, by tactical maneuvers to bring major forces to bear on the decisive area of the battlefield or on that part of the enemy's lines that it's important to overwhelm. And finally, fourth, ensuring that these masses of men brought to bear at that decisive place are put into action fast and together to make a simultaneous effort. Now, this means that it isn't enough to concentrate your resources at a critical place and time. Your organizational control must be such that you can deploy those resources to achieve your goal, whether that goal is to destroy an enemy army or to surprise a competitor with a market launch that floods a particular market segment with a new product. Now, in addition to the principle of concentration, Jomini brought geometric precision to strategy and tactics. I mean this literally. Jomini believed in the geometry of war. He introduced geometric principles of angles and force to space ratios into analysis. Jomini developed 12 geometric orders of battle. Now, these orders of battle consisted of specific geometric formations, ways to engage an enemy. And these basic geometric formations included parallel, the L shape, reinforcing of the wings, reinforced center, oblique line, a concave line, a concave broken up into an echelon with successive waves or units of troops, center attack plus one wing attack. The wise general chooses whichever order of battle is in accord with the appropriate principle. In this, Jomini has been criticized as the ultimate reductionist, reducing strategy to a checklist. No, Jomini was far from being this simplistic. Jomini's purpose was to impose order upon chaos and to demystify the Napoleonic Wars for generals and laymen alike. He recognized that the circumstances of time and place mattered a great deal, that the same principles of action would not hold true if a battle was conducted in places as varied as, say, desert, swamp, a plain, or mountainous terrain. But the principle was where you started. Now, Jomini's great contemporary was Karl von Clausewitz. Jomini and Clausewitz did not like each other, but such dislike doubtless sprang more from their natural competitiveness than from their theoretical differences. They were, after all, both men of war, shaped by the battles they fought, and of course, they fought on opposite sides. Clausewitz was a Prussian officer whose posthumously published On War in 1832 remains today the most influential of military treatises on strategy. He positioned war in a larger context. Clausewitzian thought moved us from the battlefield and into the halls of kings and presidents and demonstrated the connections between the political and military spheres. Clausewitz viewed conflict as a function of three variables: violence, chance, and political aims. It was the job of the strategist to balance these three inputs to achieve victory. Now, of the three, the variable with the most relevance for us as strategic thinkers is that element of chance, the interplay of the military commander's courage, his talent, and skill with the capabilities at his disposal as pitted against an opponent. Now, in this grappling with an opponent in the furor of battle, Clausewitz believed that the commander's insight in the face of chance was the key to victory. And he called this coup d'oeil, the glance of the eye, or the lightning insight. And this is one of the greatest contributions of Clausewitz, this notion of swift and intuitive decision-making in battle. Only recently has cognitive psychology even caught up with Clausewitz. Military establishments today, particularly the United States Marines, recognize the importance of intuition in battle, or coup d'oeil. Moreover, the latest research suggests that intuitive decision-making can be taught. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone can become a Napoleon. It does mean that our own decision-making can be sharpened if we learn to listen to that amalgam of experience and expertise that percolates in our consciousness just below the surface. Napoleon himself believed in the efficacy of intuitive decision-making. Napoleon was partial to the notion that the general's piercing insight in the heat of battle would yield victory. Napoleon said this: "The issue of a battle is the result of an instant of a thought. There is the advance with its various combinations. The battle is joined. The struggle goes on a certain time. The decisive moment presents itself. A spark of genius discloses it, and the smallest body of reserves accomplish victory." This insight doesn't come from mere God-given ability. It is not a quality that stands apart from the principles of conflict. Instead, it arises from the thinker's learning and experience and immersion in those principles. It comes from a deep understanding of the strategist's craft and of figuring out what to do when the principles don't apply. Now, the impact of Jomini was seen in the latter 19th century, while Clausewitz achieved greater prominence in the 20th century. Part of Jomini's initial impact may have been a result of his long life, his many writings, and his relentless self-promotion. He survived Clausewitz by almost 40 years, and he died only in 1869. Jomini's influence can be seen in the American Civil War in particular, and it inspired the tactics of massed frontal infantry assaults on both sides that led to massive casualties. But the fault is not Jomini's. Rather, it is the commanders who thought of strategy in terms of a checklist. And if technology had outstripped the prescribed strategic and tactical execution of Jominian principles, well then profound strategic thinking would have adapted those principles to the changed technological circumstances. Some did adapt. The Civil War yielded several practitioners who appeared ahead of their time in their creativity and their ability to adapt to fluid and chaotic situations. They recognized the futility of massed infantry assaults against an entrenched enemy, armed with long-range rifles and the devastating new round, the Minié. Southern General Stonewall Jackson believed in maneuver and surprise as powerful weapons, not just enhancements of the real business of making war. Jackson's Shenandoah Campaign of 1862 was a brilliant demonstration of the power of feint, deception, and speed of maneuver as force multipliers. His motto was always mystify, mislead, and surprise the enemy. Another Southern general's battlefield thinking was so far ahead of its time that it was not until the Second World War that his battlefield maneuvers would be fully appreciated and utilized by a new generation of warriors. Nathan Bedford Forrest's most famous aphorism appears deceptively simple, even simplistic. Get there first with the most. But this short phrase encompasses a core of strategic theory that includes surprise, maneuver, objective, speed, capabilities, and mass. Now, it's not likely that the self-taught Forrest studied Napoleon or Jomini, but he understood strategy at a visceral level. And perhaps no other general of the Civil War employed the principle of concentration better than Forrest. General Forrest's 1864 victory over a Union force twice the size of his own at the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads exemplified Jominian principles. This was Forrest's masterpiece and the archetype example of pursuing an enemy until he's all but destroyed. In this Mississippi battle, Forrest engaged and defeated a larger force and then led a 60-hour pursuit of panicked Union forces, halting the chase only after he himself was no longer able to physically remain in the saddle from exhaustion. It was this element of strategy more than any other that turned the Civil War into a protracted conflict. That bloodiest of all American conflicts was fought from 1861 to 1865, 4 years. Given the overwhelming preponderance of Northern objective advantages, the war should have lasted no longer than 2 years. Strategic thinking and leadership was the difference. Now, much later, in the Second World War, General Heinz Guderian led Hitler's panzers across Belgium and France in 1940, following the same principle as Forrest, applying overwhelming force at a single point and then pursuing an enemy relentlessly. World War I was the most horrific cauldron of war and death the world had known up to that point. And for 4 years, hundreds of thousands of soldiers hurled themselves over open ground against machine guns and resulted in a bloodletting and human slaughter on a titanic scale. Strategy is partly to blame. The strategic culture of militaries of the time advocated the offensive à outrance, or to the bitter end. Now, they were attempting in World War I to concentrate their forces as was prescribed by Jean Monnet, but they had failed to recognize that technology had shifted the advantage to the defense. World War I saw a collision of obsolete strategy, horse cavalry charges that had worked in 1870, for instance, with the new weapons of war like the machine gun. The horrors of World War I led to a rethinking of strategy, and one of the most prominent military thinkers of the early 20th century developed a strategic theory that appears quite powerful and is useful outside the purely military affairs. Basil Liddell-Hart's study of the frontal assault in hundreds of battles over 2 millennia of war led him to conclude that the frontal assault had limited utility. He advocated his own theory of indirect approach that incorporated first-hand experience of World War I with the new weapons introduced in that conflict, particularly the armored tank. Now, Basil Liddell-Hart's deep development of the strategy of the indirect approach appears in an amalgam of earlier thought, but it gained a sense of urgency from the horrific casualties suffered in World War I on the Western Front. As we moved from World War I into a new era of warfare in the 1930s, other strategic theories emerged as responses to changing conditions, political as well as technological. And one of the most notorious of these was the field of geopolitics, made notorious by its most enthusiastic proponents. At the heart of every great theory is an insight so blinding and yet so obvious that it inspires thousands. The problem comes when the insight is pushed beyond its natural limits and entire philosophies are built around it, to the exclusion of other, perhaps equally valid insights. And geopolitics arose in the early 20th century and eventually claimed status as a separate social science. It was geographical determinism. Geography determined the destinies of states and the fate of men. Sir Halford Mackinder believed that particular geography bestowed certain immutable advantages on the holder of particular terrain. Moreover, these advantages over time could lead a nation-state under a determined leader to eventually extend influence over the entire world. And one of the most famous dictums of geopolitics was formulated by Sir Halford Mackinder in 1904, and it is ominous in what it pretends. Who rules Eastern Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world. But geopolitics soon suffered as it was adopted by Nazi Germany as a pseudo-scientific justification for German expansion. But today, geopolitics has made a comeback, and the term has seeped into the public discourse as a kind of rhetorical incantation to lend gravitas to what one says. 2 lectures from now, we devote an entire lecture to the contribution of geography to our understanding of strategy. Now, from the Enlightenment theorists to Napoleon and on into the 20th century, Modern military thought about strategy has gained clarity and precision. Here are some key points. Regardless of how chaotic a situation may be, there are principles that can give shape to your thinking about the situation. Immersion in such principles allows for coup d'oeil flashes of insight. And the upshot of this 200-year stretch of strategic history is that there are unvarying principles of strategy, but they are akin to techniques. They do not stand alone as a magic formula. They do not transform a soldier into a great general. No, there is no checklist to guarantee victory. Theorists give us tools. And two tools worth remembering are the indirect approach and the strategy of the central position. We must learn how and when to use such tools. For instance, the frontal assault is used far too often. Strategic thinking requires much more than memorization of principles. Strategic thinking requires you to develop a keen and agile mind that is capable of independent and responsive thought. Strategic thinking requires you to develop yourself as a strategist, and you do this by thorough preparation of your capabilities, a unique set of capabilities, understanding of general principles of conflict, and detailed tactical follow-through. So keep your own strategic thinking capabilities in mind as we turn next time to a consideration of current-day strategic principles, starting with those of the United States Army.